The Ridgepoint Police Department didn't need to hide their corruption. They wore it like a badge. They ruled through intimidation, buried complaints, and made sure no one dared to challenge them. For years, their power went unchecked, until they made the mistake of arresting Elijah Cole. They accused him of using a counterfeit bill without even checking it. They beat him, humiliated him, threw him in a cell, convinced he was just another man they could crush without consequence. But they didn't realize the truth. Elijah Cole wasn't just another man. He was in the Special Forces. He had spent years tracking war criminals. He knew exactly how to take down men who thought they were untouchable. The bill was real, and so was the reckoning that was coming. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The midday sun hung high over Ridgepoint, pressing down with an unforgiving heat that made everything feel a little slower, a little heavier. Elijah Cole walked along the cracked sidewalk, the weight of the past few days settling into his bones like an ache he couldn't quite shake. The town looked the same as it always had. Neat little houses, faded storefronts, American flags hanging from porches like reminders of a promise that never quite included everyone. It wasn't a long walk home, just a few blocks past the town square, past streets that held memories he had no interest in revisiting. He had driven across entire countries, trekked through war zones, crossed miles of desert under the scorching sun, but somehow, walking through his own hometown felt more foreign than any of it. The gas station at the corner stood exactly as he remembered it. An old building with peeling paint, a sun-bleached awning, and a flickering neon sign above the door. He had stopped there 100 times as a kid, back when Ridgepoint was just a place to grow up in, before he knew what it really was. His boots scuffed against the pavement as he stepped inside, welcoming the blast of cool air from the overhead vent. The place smelled the same. Dust, motor oil, stale coffee. There weren't many people inside. A teenager behind the counter, scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention. A middle-aged man in a work uniform grabbing a soda from the cooler. Just another quiet day. Elijah moved through the aisles, grabbing a bottle of water and a pack of gum before making his way to the counter. The cashier finally looked up as he rang up the total, his gaze lingering a second longer than necessary. Not in recognition, in something else. Elijah pulled a 20 from his wallet and set it on the counter. That was when he noticed it, the hesitation. The kid's fingers hovered over the bill, a flicker of something crossing his face before he reached for it. Slowly, almost too slowly, he picked it up, turning it in his hands, holding it to the light like it might reveal some hidden secret. Elijah exhaled quietly, his patience thinning. It's real. The cashier didn't look at him. Just checking. A pause. Too long. Something wasn't right. Then, a shift in the kid's body language. His eyes darted down, just for a second, to something beneath the counter. Elijah recognized the motion before it even finished. A silent alarm. The realization settled deep in his chest. But he didn't move. Didn't speak. What was there to say? The kid's shoulders were tense now, his expression carefully blank. The silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken, something ugly. Finally, the cashier slid his change across the counter and muttered, "Have a good one." But the words were hollow, forced, like they were only there to mask what had already been set in motion. Elijah took his things, turned, and walked outside into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat pressed down like a weight as he made his way down the sidewalk, the plastic bag crinkling in his grip. He wasn't thinking about what had just happened. Not really. Not because it didn't matter, but because it was the kind of thing that always sat just beneath the surface. Always there, waiting for the right moment to remind him. He had spent years overseas, training, fighting, hunting men who thought they were untouchable. He had seen corruption, violence, power unchecked. And yet, right here, in the town he had grown up in, he was still walking the same tightrope, still being watched. He was just a few blocks from home when he heard the sirens, a low whine in the distance, growing louder, sharper, until the sound wasn't just passing through. It was coming for him. He didn't turn around. Not yet. The rhythm of his steps stayed the same. Steady, controlled, refusing to give the sound more weight than it deserved. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe they were heading somewhere else. Then came the flash of red and blue lights, sweeping across the pavement, stretching long shadows ahead of him. A patrol car slowed beside him, crawling forward like a predator, sizing up its prey. Then another. They weren't passing through. They were here. Elijah stopped walking as the first car pulled up ahead, blocking his path. The second one braked just behind him, boxing him in. The air felt different now, heavier, thicker, with something unspoken. The doors opened, and two officers stepped out like they had already made up their minds. Brian Tate and Paul Riggins. Elijah didn't know their names yet, but he didn't have to. He knew their type, the way they walked, the way they carried themselves, the way they looked at him, not with curiosity, with expectation. They had been called out here for something. That meant there had to be a problem. And if there wasn't a problem, they'd make one. Tate, the taller of the two, broad-shouldered with a face that carried the kind of smug confidence only a man who had never been told no could wear, spoke first. His voice was casual, almost too casual. "You mind stopping right there for a second?" Elijah didn't move, didn't protest, didn't do anything that could be twisted into something it wasn't. He had learned long ago that men like this didn't need much of an excuse. "What's the problem?" His voice was level, his posture relaxed but not submissive. Tate's eyes flicked down to the bag in Elijah's hand. "Where are you coming from?" Elijah shouldn't have had to answer that, but he did. "The gas station." Tate nodded slowly, exchanging a glance with Riggins. "You pay with cash?" Elijah's fingers curled slightly around the plastic bag. Not in anger, not in fear, in preparation. "Yeah." Another glance between the officers. A silent conversation. Tate sighed, stepping forward just slightly, making himself bigger than he needed to be. "We got a call about a counterfeit bill." Elijah didn't react, not immediately. He just let those words settle between them, thick and heavy in the heat. There it was, the excuse. His mind was already running through the possibilities, through the outcomes, through the ways this could unfold. He could argue, but arguing wouldn't matter. He could refuse to answer any more questions, but that would only feed into whatever script they had already written. So he took a slow breath, kept his voice even. "It wasn't counterfeit." Tate tilted his head slightly, his smile thin. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station?" It was never really a question. And as Riggins reached for the cuffs, Elijah realized it didn't matter what he said next, because this was already happening. The heat was relentless, pressing thick and stifling against Elijah's skin as he stood between the two police cruisers, the midday sun casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. The town around him remained unchanged, quiet, indifferent, storefronts resting under the weight of another slow afternoon, people tucked away in their homes or behind shop windows, watching without watching. It was the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from habit, from the kind of practiced detachment that allowed injustice to play out in plain sight without interruption. And in the center of it all, Elijah stood, unmoved. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station." Tate's voice carried an air of false patience, the kind that stretched thin over barely concealed condescension. The tone of a man who already thought he was in control of the situation. His fingers twitched near his holster, not gripping, not drawing, just there, a presence, a reminder. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't drop his gaze from the man trying to force him into compliance through sheer expectation. "I do mind," he said, his voice calm, unwavering. Tate exhaled, tilting his head slightly, as if trying to decide whether he found that amusing or annoying. "That right?" Elijah nodded, shifting the plastic bag in his grip just slightly. "Because I didn't do anything, and unless you're actually charging me with something, I'm not going anywhere." Tate made a sound in the back of his throat, a dry, humorless chuckle, as if Elijah had said something absurd, something that didn't fit the script he had already written in his head. "We got a call about a counterfeit bill," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the bag. "You were at that gas station. You paid with cash." Elijah let out a slow breath, the kind meant to keep frustration at bay. But there was no keeping it at bay when the weight of what was happening pressed against him like a heavy hand on his back. The same game. The same tired tactics. They didn't see a man standing on a public sidewalk, walking home after a stop at the gas station. They didn't see a former soldier, a man who had given his life to fighting real criminals, real threats. They saw a black man with cash in his hand. And that had been enough. "The bill wasn't fake," Elijah said, voice measured but firm. Tate let the words settle for a beat before giving an exaggerated sigh, rubbing a hand over his face as if he were the one being inconvenienced. "Look," he said, his tone dipping into something just a little sharper, just a little more patronizing. "We can stand here all day and go back and forth, or you can just do the smart thing and come with us. We'll clear this up quick, and you can be on your way." Elijah wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what would happen the second he let them get him in the car. The misunderstanding would become something else. The cuffs would go on, and suddenly, cooperation wouldn't matter anymore. He had seen it too many times, had heard the stories, had lived long enough to know that a man like him didn't walk away from situations like this untouched. "No," he said. Simple. Absolute. Tate's mouth twitched. The amusement was gone now, replaced with something harder, something frustrated. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in," he said, voice tightening, his body shifting forward just slightly, pushing into Elijah's space. "I understand perfectly," Elijah shot back, not giving an inch. "I understand that a white kid in that gas station could have paid with cash, walked out, and never thought twice about it. I understand that I did the exact same thing, and now I have 2 cop cars blocking my path like I just knocked over a liquor store. I understand that this isn't about a counterfeit bill. It's about the fact that I don't get the benefit of the doubt." Tate's jaw tensed, his fingers curling into a loose fist near his belt. "Watch yourself." Elijah let out a dry, bitter laugh, the heat pressing down on him, mixing with the slow-burning frustration curling in his chest. "Or what?" he asked, lifting his chin slightly, watching the way the tension thickened between them. "You gonna beat me right here in broad daylight? Make up some excuse about me resisting? You gonna make sure your body cams malfunction when it happens? Tell everyone I was acting suspicious, so the town shrugs and looks the other way?" He saw it then, the way Riggins shifted, uncomfortable. The way Tate's nostrils flared, his skin turning red beneath the weight of his growing irritation. They weren't used to this, to the pushback, to the way Elijah refused to cower beneath the weight of their authority. Tate exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You want to run your mouth? Go ahead," he said, but his voice didn't carry the same ease it had before. "Doesn't change the fact that you're coming with us." Elijah squared his shoulders. Not without a charge. Tate's lips pressed into a thin line. His patience was wearing out. And that was the moment it happened. The moment he made the choice. He nodded at Riggins, a silent order. "Move in." Riggins stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs, his hand clamping around Elijah's arm. And Elijah reacted before he even had a chance to think. A shift of weight, a subtle turn of his wrist, breaking the grip without force, without resistance, without anything that should have escalated the situation. But that was all Tate needed, all the confirmation he had been waiting for. The frustration hardened into something ugly. "You're resisting." The words were sharp, cold, final. "No," Elijah said, voice low, steady, controlled. "I'm not," but it didn't matter, because Tate had already decided that he was. And that was all the justification he needed. The shove came hard and fast, Tate's hands slamming into Elijah's chest, forcing him back a step. Elijah's jaw clenched. Not in fear, not in submission. In restraint. He saw the way Tate squared up, the way Riggins adjusted his stance, bracing himself like he was ready for a fight. They wanted this. They wanted him to snap, to react, to give them the excuse they needed to turn this into something worse. Elijah had seen men like them overseas, men who thrived on unchecked power, who needed to create enemies just so they could justify the violence already burning in their blood. His pulse was steady, his muscles coiled, not to attack, but to endure. Because this wasn't the fight. Not yet. Tate's lip curled as he reached for his baton, his patience gone, his temper slipping loose like an unchecked animal. And Elijah knew exactly what was coming next, because Tate wasn't interested in an arrest anymore. He wanted to punish. And Elijah wasn't about to make it easy for him. The air had changed, the heat still pressed down, thick and unrelenting, but now it carried something else, something volatile, the weight of an unspoken battle settling over the cracked pavement. The town around them remained the same. A handful of people watching from doorways and shaded porches, a few cars idling at intersections, engines humming low, their drivers glancing over but saying nothing. No one stepped in, no one spoke up, because this was the kind of thing that happened in places like Ridgepoint, and no one had ever stopped it before. Tate rolled his shoulders like a man preparing for something inevitable, something he had already made peace with, his patience wearing thin, his need for control gnawing at whatever restraint he had left. He had expected submission, had wanted compliance, had come here already believing in an ending that Elijah refused to give him, and that was the problem. Men like Tate didn't like to be denied. Elijah could see it in the way the officer's fingers flexed near his baton, the way Riggins hovered just slightly behind him, waiting, watching, both of them needing an excuse, a moment, a reason to take this further than it had to go, and Elijah wasn't going to give them one. He had fought war criminals overseas. He had tracked killers through mountains, had broken through enemy lines, had taken down men who actually deserved it. And yet here he was, standing on his own street, in his own town, facing down two men with badges who thought they were untouchable. And he was done pretending this was anything other than what it was. "You need to turn around and put your hands behind your back," Tate said, slow and deliberate. The mock patience stretched so thin it was barely holding together. Elijah held his ground. "For what? I already told you." "No, you didn't." Tate's nostrils flared. "You're resisting an investigation." Elijah let out a sharp breath, a humorless laugh that only made the officer stiffen. "That's not a charge. You refused to come with us because I didn't do anything. You refused to let my officer detain you. I pulled my arm away because I don't like being grabbed in the middle of the street." Tate's mouth curled into something ugly, something smug, like he had been waiting for Elijah to say those exact words. "So you're saying you pulled away?" The bait, obvious, heavy-handed, and infuriating. Elijah's jaw tightened, the frustration curling in his chest, heavy and boiling. "Don't twist my words." "I don't have to twist anything," Tate said, spreading his hands like he was presenting some kind of grand, undeniable truth. "You admitted it. That's resisting." Elijah could feel it, the pull of it, the slow tightening of the noose, the way Tate was maneuvering, twisting reality to fit the outcome he wanted. And that was the moment Elijah realized the truth. This had never been about the money. This had never been about the bill, or the gas station, or some hollow excuse about an investigation. This had been the plan all along. They had wanted this from the second they pulled up. The fake pleasantries, the pretense of protocol. It had all been a game, a script they had played out 100 times before. Because men like Tate didn't stop people like Elijah to check counterfeit bills. They stopped them because they could. And they didn't like it when the people they stopped talked back. Tate exhaled, shaking his head as if disappointed, like he had tried to be reasonable, like Elijah had left him no other choice. "You're going to jail," he said flatly. Elijah's blood burned. "On what charge?" Tate didn't answer. He just stepped closer, crowding the space, forcing Elijah's body to react, to shift slightly, to adjust his balance. And that was the moment. The smallest movement, the tiniest shift, and Tate pounced on it like a predator sinking its teeth into prey. "He's resisting!" The words came sharp and loud, cutting through the air like a gunshot, and suddenly, everything happened at once. Tate lunged, shoving Elijah hard in the chest, pushing him backward. Riggins grabbed at his arm, trying to yank him around, but Elijah wasn't having it. His body reacted before his mind had a chance to tell it otherwise, muscles coiling, trained instinct kicking in, the deeply ingrained need to defend, to fight back. His feet dug in, his arms tensed, his pulse roared. "Stop resisting!" Tate barked, his voice thick with self-righteous fury. "I'm not resisting!" Elijah snapped back, his own voice rising now, his frustration spilling out hot and sharp. "I didn't do anything! Get your damn hands off me!" But Tate wasn't listening. He wasn't hearing, because he didn't care. His face twisted into something cruel, something vicious, and then the baton came down. The first strike landed hard across Elijah's ribs, a sharp explosion of pain spreading through his side, but he didn't go down, so Tate swung again, and again, and again. Elijah staggered, but didn't fall, his vision sparking, his breath coming short, his body refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him drop. And that only made them hit harder. A sharp blow to the back of the leg, meant to buckle his stance, a baton slamming against his shoulder, sending shockwaves through his muscles. The world tilted slightly, the pavement coming up fast, hot and rough against his skin as his knees hit first. Then his palms, a knee pressed into his spine, shoving him down, the pressure crushing, suffocating, pinning him like an animal. "Stop fighting!" "I'm not fighting," but it didn't matter. Hands wrenched his arms behind him, metal cutting into his wrists as the cuffs locked into place. The weight of two bodies pressing him down, holding him there just long enough for the message to sink in. Elijah tasted blood, hot and metallic in his mouth, his vision blurring at the edges, his breath coming in uneven bursts. The world around him blurred, but the sound remained sharp. The voices, the heavy breathing, the distant murmurs of people watching but doing nothing. And Tate, standing over him, still gripping the baton, his face flushed with exertion, and something else, something like satisfaction. It had never been about the bill. It had never been about anything other than this. Elijah had known it was coming, and yet, as they finally hauled him up, shoving him toward the cruiser, his ribs aching, his skin raw, the anger still burned beneath the pain. Because he might have been in cuffs. He might have been beaten, bruised, thrown in the back of a squad car like some common criminal, but he wasn't broken, and this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The squad car's back seat wasn't built for comfort. Hard plastic, slick with years of sweat and spilled blood, the lingering scent of cigarettes and cheap cologne mixing with the sharp metallic bite of his own blood still running from his split lip. The heat had settled inside the car, thick and stale, the air conditioning barely trickling through the vents, suffocating rather than cooling. But Elijah wasn't thinking about any of that. Pain throbbed through his ribs with every breath, the dull ache in his wrist from the too tight cuffs radiating up his arms. But it wasn't the pain that fueled him now. It wasn't the bruises forming beneath his skin, or the sting of fresh wounds. It was the anger, the kind that sat heavy in the chest, simmering, pressing against the ribs, like something trying to break free. Tate sat in the driver's seat, one hand resting lazily on the wheel, the other drumming absent-mindedly against the gear shift. Riggins rode shotgun, glancing at Elijah through the rearview mirror with that same blank, unreadable expression he had worn before, like he was here but not here, present but disconnected, floating just above the reality of what had just happened. Elijah shifted against the seat, his body protesting the movement, His breath sharp as pain curled up his side, but he barely noticed it. The rage overpowered everything. "You feel good about yourselves?" His voice was raw, rough from exhaustion, but steady. He didn't care if they ignored him. He wasn't speaking for their benefit. He was speaking because he refused to sit in silence. Tate let out a slow exhale, tapping his fingers against the steering wheel, his patience already wearing thin. "Shut up." Elijah gave a slow nod, lips pressing together, before he let out a short, bitter laugh. "Yeah, that's what you want, isn't it?" His head tilted slightly, eyes burning into the back of Tate's skull. "Beat a man in the middle of the street, throw him in cuffs, drag him off like a dog, and expect him to sit here quiet, head down, just taking it like it's normal." His voice darkened, dipped into something heavier, like, "This is just another day for you." Tate's fingers tightened on the wheel, but he didn't respond. "I bet it is, though, isn't it?" Elijah continued, his voice rolling through the car, measured, deliberate, every word pressing into them like a scalpel carving through flesh. "I bet this ain't the first time you did this. Bet it won't be the last. You knew exactly what you were doing the second you pulled up. Didn't even need to ask questions. Didn't need proof. Didn't need a damn thing but your gut instinct and a black man walking down the street." Riggins shifted slightly, eyes flicking to the side window, jaw tightening. But Tate? Tate didn't flinch. He kept his gaze on the road, mouth set in a firm line, expression unreadable, but Elijah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip had stiffened around the wheel. "Tell me, how's it feel?" Elijah pressed, his voice lower now, colder. "How's it feel knowing you got nothing? Knowing you didn't find a fake bill? Knowing you got no weapons on me, no drugs, no crime, not a damn thing to justify what you just did? How's it feel knowing all you got is the fact that you wanted to do it?" Tate sucked his teeth, shaking his head like he was bored, like this was nothing, like Elijah was just noise. "You don't know when to shut the hell up, do you?" Elijah let out another laugh, a hollow sound. "Oh, I know when to shut up. I learned real early in life. You think I don't know how this works? You think I don't know how this story ends? The quiet ones, the ones who lower their eyes and bite their tongue and let this kind of bullshit happen to them over and over again, those are the ones you like. The ones who make it easy." His voice sharpened, cracked into something razor-edged. "I bet that's why you're pissed, right? I wasn't supposed to talk back. I wasn't supposed to push back. I was supposed to let you have your little power trip. Let you feel big. Let you feel like you run the world with that badge strapped to your chest. And now you don't know what to do with yourself, because no matter how much you beat me, no matter how much you throw me around, I'm still here talking." Riggins inhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting in his seat again, that same stiffness in his movements, like a man trying to convince himself he was fine with something he wasn't fine with. Tate smirked, letting the silence settle before shaking his head. "You think this is the first time someone ran their mouth at me like this?" "No," Elijah said, his voice steady, "but I bet it's the first time it mattered." The smirk faded, just for a second. Then Tate let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, shifting in his seat like he was stretching, like this conversation was making him tired. "You want to know what I think?" he mused, voice dripping with that same patronizing tone he had used before, the same mock patience that made Elijah's blood boil. "I think you're the problem. I think you walk around with this big chip on your shoulder like the world owes you something, and when things don't go your way, you gotta blame someone else. You had to run your mouth, make a scene, try and act like you were in charge when you were never in charge." Elijah's tongue rolled over his split lip, tasting blood. Tate turned his head just slightly, just enough for Elijah to catch his smirk in the rearview mirror. "And now, look at you, all banged up, bleeding in the back of a squad car. And for what?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "For nothing. 'Cause the only thing that's going to happen now is you sitting in a holding cell. That's it. You think you're making some big stand? You think you're proving something? You're not. You're just another loudmouth who doesn't know when to shut up." Elijah leaned forward as much as the cuffs would allow, his eyes locking onto Tate's in the mirror, his voice dropping to something quieter, something lethal. "No, I'm the man who's gonna make sure this doesn't just go away." Tate stilled for half a second. It was barely anything, just a flicker. A hesitation small enough that most people wouldn't have noticed it, but Elijah did, and he knew then, in that moment, that he had gotten under the man's skin. Tate scoffed, shaking his head as he turned his attention back to the road. "Big words," he muttered. "You'll be singing a different tune in a couple hours." Elijah leaned back against the seat, chest rising and falling steadily, feeling the slow, aching pulse of pain radiating from every inch of his body. Maybe he would be singing a different tune. Maybe they'd find a way to keep him quiet. Maybe this wasn't going to end the way he wanted. But right now, in this moment, Tate was the one who looked like he was trying to convince himself. The police station in Ridgepoint was a squat, sun-bleached building that had seen better days, its brick facade cracked in places, the old metal doors worn from decades of hands shoving them open and slamming them shut. It wasn't a large station. This wasn't a city with a real crime problem. It was a place where petty arrests padded statistics, where a few disorderly conduct charges here and there kept the numbers looking good, where men like Tate and Riggins operated unchecked because no one had ever told them not to. Elijah had been through bigger doors than these, marched into buildings with men who had real power, men who controlled the lives of hundreds, of thousands, men who actually mattered in the grand scheme of things. And yet, as Tate yanked the squad car into the lot, killing the engine with a flick of his wrist, Elijah could feel the weight of what was about to happen settling over him. Not fear, not that, a slow, burning certainty. Because he knew, even if they didn't yet, that this wasn't the end of the story. Tate and Riggins climbed out first, slamming their doors shut in unison, their boots crunching against the gravel as they rounded the vehicle, moving with the kind of unchecked arrogance that came with knowing this place was theirs, knowing they were untouchable here. The back door swung open, and before Elijah could shift, Tate was on him, yanking him forward, gripping his arm in a way that sent another sharp bolt of pain through his already bruised ribs. Elijah hissed through his teeth, jerking slightly at the contact, his body naturally resisting the unnecessary force. And that was all it took. Tate took the moment and ran with it. "Stop fighting!" The words came sharp, barked out with the kind of exaggerated authority meant to be overheard, meant to send a message to whoever was watching, as if Elijah had been struggling, as if he hadn't spent the entire ride sitting still, barely moving, barely breathing through the pain. It was all about optics. A man like Tate didn't just need control, he needed to be seen having it. He yanked Elijah harder, shoving him toward the station doors, Riggins keeping pace just behind them, his silence somehow louder than Tate's posturing. They pushed through the entrance, stepping into the cooled air of the precinct, the fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead, the place smelling of stale coffee, sweat, and old paperwork. Inside, officers sat at desks cluttered with case files and half-eaten lunches, phones ringing in the background, the low murmur of business as usual filling the space. A few heads turned when they entered, but no one reacted. Not in surprise, not in curiosity, because this wasn't unusual. It was just another arrest, just another man being dragged in, bruised, bloodied, another body moving through the system with no expectation of justice. Tate shoved Elijah toward the processing desk, the officer behind it, a balding man with glasses too small for his face, barely glancing up as he reached for a clipboard. "Charge!" Tate wiped a hand over his mouth, pretending to think, like he hadn't already made up his mind long before they pulled Elijah off the street. "Obstruction. Disorderly conduct. Resisting." Elijah let out a slow breath, tasting iron in his mouth, feeling the sharp sting of the cut on his lip as he exhaled through his nose. You left out the part where I broke into a bank and stole 100 grand. His voice was rough, edged with exhaustion, but still carrying enough weight to cut through the thin layer of civility Tate was trying to maintain. The officer behind the desk barely acknowledged the sarcasm, scribbling down the charges before nodding toward a side door. Holding, Tate grabbed Elijah's arm again, dragging him toward the hallway leading to the holding cells, his grip tighter than necessary, fingers digging into bruises that were already forming. Elijah let the pain settle, let it root deep in his bones, because he knew what was coming. He had seen it before. The moment when a man like Tate realized he had made a mistake. They reached the holding area, a row of small cells with rusting bars, the dim lighting casting shadows over the concrete walls. Tate shoved him forward, unlocking one of the cells and pushing him inside without ceremony, letting him stumble forward before catching himself against the metal bench bolted to the floor. Elijah took his time straightening, rolling his shoulders, every movement slow, deliberate, controlled. He turned, resting his back against the bars, looking at Tate with something close to pity. "You think this is over?" Elijah's voice was calm, the exhaustion evident, but the underlying steel still there. "You think you just get to walk away from this?" Tate exhaled through his nose, shaking his head like he had heard it all before. "You got real big words for a man in cuffs." Elijah tilted his head slightly, licking at the cut on his lip before responding. "And you got real big confidence for a man who doesn't even know who the hell he just arrested." There it was. The flicker. Just a brief shift. A small, nearly imperceptible hesitation in Tate's eyes. The first sliver of doubt creeping in. Riggins, standing just a step behind Tate, frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Elijah didn't answer. Not yet, because he wanted them to find out on their own. Tate scoffed, shaking his head. But there was something forced about it now. Something slightly off as he turned to Riggins. "Get his prints." Riggins hesitated, just for a second, then nodded, stepping away to head toward the processing station. Tate lingered, watching Elijah with something new in his expression. Not concern, not fear, but curiosity. And Elijah smiled, because that meant the unraveling had already started. 15 minutes later, everything changed. Elijah sat in the cell, legs stretched out in front of him, fingers rolling idly over the fresh bruises along his wrists where the cuffs had been digging in. He could hear the low murmur of voices down the hall, the shuffle of papers, the beep of the fingerprint scanner processing his prints into the system. And then silence. A long pause, then footsteps, fast and sharp. Boots striking against tile. Tate reappeared first, moving briskly, his expression no longer smug, no longer relaxed. His jaw was tight, his mouth pressed into a hard line, his shoulders stiff. Riggins followed behind him, looking less sure, less put together, his hand gripping the edge of a manila file folder as if it held something heavy, something damning. They stopped in front of the cell. Elijah didn't move. Didn't acknowledge the tension rolling off them in waves. He just lifted his gaze, slowly, deliberately, taking his time before speaking. "What's the matter?" he asked, voice smooth, easy, like he hadn't been beaten in the street an hour ago. Like he was the one who had just won. Tate didn't answer. But Riggins? Riggins swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the folder, his voice quieter than before. "Elijah Cole." He read off the report, and then came the words that shattered everything. "Former Special Forces. Highly decorated. War hero." And then the real question. What the hell did we just do? Elijah leaned back against the cold metal bench, stretching his legs out just slightly, shifting enough to send a sharp, calculated bolt of pain through his ribs. A reminder of exactly what these men had done to him. A reminder of why this wasn't over. He let the silence linger a little longer. Let them sit in it. Let them stew in their own failure. Then, finally, he spoke. "Something wrong?" His voice was smooth, controlled, a stark contrast to the tension thickening in the air. He tilted his head slightly, the barest hint of amusement flickering in his eyes as he met Tate's gaze. "You're looking a little pale, officer." Tate's jaw clenched. He wasn't ready to admit it yet. Elijah let the corner of his mouth twitch into something that wasn't quite a smirk, wasn't quite a smile, just enough to push. "You were real confident back there, screaming about how I was resisting, swinging that baton like you had something to prove." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, eyes cold. "Guess it's not so funny now, is it?" Riggins exhaled through his nose, shifting uncomfortably, his grip tightening on the manila folder, as if the weight of the paper in his hands could anchor him to something solid. His eyes flicked to Tate, waiting, needing direction. But for once, Tate had none. Elijah could see it, the doubt creeping in, the edges of his confidence fraying as he tried to work out a way to turn this around. But there wasn't one. They had beaten and arrested a decorated war hero, a man whose record wasn't just clean, it was the kind that got people handshakes from the president, the kind that got flags folded into triangles and handed to grieving families when things went wrong. They had picked the wrong man, and they knew it. Before Tate could find his words, the heavy double doors at the front of the station swung open with a loud, authoritative creak, the sound cutting through the tense silence like a blade. Sheriff Roy Delaney had arrived. He walked in with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had spent years knowing he was the most powerful person in any room he entered. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, his belt heavy with the weight of authority. A man who had built his career on knowing how to put out fires before they burned too hot. And this was an inferno waiting to happen. His eyes swept over the station, scanning the room with a practiced gaze, assessing, calculating, figuring out exactly how much damage control needed to be done. His gaze landed on Tate and Riggins first, then flicked briefly to the open file in Riggins's hand before settling on Elijah. And Elijah knew in that moment that Delaney understood everything. The sheriff didn't waste time. He turned toward the officer behind the processing desk, his voice cutting through the room like a sharpened blade. "Has he been booked yet?" The officer shifted in his chair, suddenly hyper-aware of the way the room had shifted. No, sir. Just running his prints." Delaney nodded once, slow, controlled, then turned toward Tate. "Take a walk." Tate's nostrils flared slightly, his pride warring with common sense, but he didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded once and stepped back, his shoulders stiff as he walked toward the far side of the station. Riggins hesitated for half a second longer before following. Elijah watched it all unfold, watched how quickly the power dynamics in the room shifted, how even men like Tate knew when they had gone too far. Delaney waited until the two officers were far enough away before turning back to Elijah, his gaze unreadable, his expression carefully neutral. Then, finally, he spoke. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice smooth, deliberate, "I'd like to offer my apologies for how my men handled this situation." Elijah's laugh was sharp, bitter, edged with something cold. He leaned forward slightly, his ribs protesting the movement, but he ignored it. Refused to give this man the satisfaction of seeing him wince. "You gonna apologize for the part where they beat the hell out of me too?" Delaney didn't blink. "I'd like to offer you a way out of this." And there it was. The real reason he was here. Not an apology, not an admission of guilt. A deal. Elijah exhaled through his nose, letting his head tilt slightly to the side, studying the sheriff's face, looking for the cracks in his armor, for the lie beneath the surface. "Let me guess," Elijah murmured, voice steady. "You want me to forget this ever happened." Delaney's lips pressed into a thin line, his silence confirming what they both already knew. "Let's be real clear about something," Elijah continued, his voice low and sharp, a blade gliding over skin. "Your boys dragged me off the street for nothing, beat me bloody, threw me in here like a common criminal." He shifted, shoulders rolling back, spine straightening, and for the first time, it wasn't just Delaney assessing him. Elijah was assessing right back. "Now you want to slap a little Band-Aid on it and send me on my way?" Delaney inhaled slowly, holding Elijah's gaze, the faintest glimmer of irritation flickering beneath his calm exterior. I'm prepared to make this right." Elijah let the words settle. Let them roll over him like the heat outside. Let them hang between them like smoke before shaking his head. Just once. "No," he said. "You're not." Delaney's expression didn't change, but Elijah could see it. The slow, creeping realization that this wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. Because Elijah wasn't done, not by a long shot. Sheriff Roy Delaney had spent the better part of his career making problems disappear before they became problems. That was the unspoken skill required to run a department like Ridgepoint's. Not just enforcing the law, but controlling the narrative. He knew how to smooth over the rough edges of an ugly situation, how to make sure the wrong kind of trouble never made it past the front doors of the station. And this was the wrong kind of trouble. Elijah could see it in the way Delaney stood there, his expression carefully measured, his stance just loose enough to seem relaxed, just tight enough to suggest restraint. He wasn't angry. Not yet, but he wasn't pleased either. And men like Delaney didn't like having to clean up someone else's mess. "Let's take a walk," the sheriff said, voice smooth, a suggestion rather than an order. But they both knew there was no choice in it. Elijah pushed himself up from the metal bench, his muscles protesting the movement, pain radiating from every place Tate and Riggins had left their mark. His ribs throbbed in time with his heartbeat. His wrists were raw from the cuffs. His lip still stung, split and swollen. But if Delaney was hoping for a show of weakness, he wasn't going to get it. Elijah kept his steps steady as he followed him out of the holding area, past desks cluttered with paperwork, past officers pretending not to look, not to listen. Every movement in the room had slowed, every conversation hushed to nothing but murmurs, as if everyone was waiting to see how this would play out. Delaney led him down a short hallway and into his office, closing the door behind them with a soft, deliberate click. It was the kind of office built for power. The heavy wooden desk, the framed commendations, the old black-and-white photos of Ridgepoint's past sheriffs hanging like relics on the wall. The air carried the faint scent of leather and aftershave, an atmosphere of control woven into every inch of the space. Delaney moved behind his desk, lowering himself into the high-backed chair with the ease of a man who had done this 100 times before. He folded his hands together, let out a slow breath, and studied Elijah with a kind of calculated patience, like he was waiting for the moment when this conversation could go his way. "I'll be honest with you," Delaney said finally, his voice calm, deliberate. "I don't like how this was handled." Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't like how it was handled?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the desk, meeting Delaney's gaze head-on. "You don't like that your boys dragged me off the street for no reason? That they beat the hell out of me? Or that they did all that before checking who I was?" Delaney didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't react. He wasn't a man who liked to acknowledge mistakes, not unless there was something in it for him. "I don't like that this got messy," Delaney corrected, his voice steady. "I don't like that we've got a situation on our hands that could have been avoided if certain officers had used better judgment." He exhaled slowly, like he was burdened by the weight of it all, as if this were just another inconvenience, another problem to be solved. "But what's done is done. I'm more interested in how we move forward." Elijah studied him, took in the ease with which he spoke, the way his words were carefully chosen, softened just enough to make it sound like he was offering a reasonable solution instead of covering his own ass. "You mean how you cover your tracks," Elijah said. Delaney's mouth twitched slightly, just the smallest hint of irritation breaking through his carefully neutral expression. "I mean how we keep this from becoming something bigger than it needs to be." Elijah leaned back slightly, his ribs protesting the movement, but he didn't let the pain show. "Define bigger than it needs to be." Delaney let out a slow breath, reaching into the top drawer of his desk, pulling out a plain white envelope, setting it down on the polished wood between them. It was thick, heavy enough that Elijah didn't need to open it to know exactly what was inside. "This is a gesture of goodwill," Delaney said. A way to acknowledge that mistakes were made, and that you shouldn't have been put through this. It's not an admission of guilt. It's a way for us to move forward without any unnecessary trouble. Elijah let his gaze drift down to the envelope, to the carefully placed, carefully meaningless attempt at making this all go away. Then he lifted his eyes back to Delaney's face, watching him closely. "And if I take it, then you walk out of here today," Delaney said, his voice even. "No charges, no bad blood, no reason to drag this through the mud. We both know how this kind of thing plays out in the media, how these situations can get twisted into something they're not." Elijah exhaled slowly through his nose, rolling his tongue over his split lip, letting the taste of blood ground him in reality. "This situation isn't twisted," he said, his voice sharp. "It's exactly what it looks like. Your officers picked me up, brutalized me, humiliated me, and only when they realized I wasn't just some nobody did they start scrambling to clean it up." He nodded toward the envelope. "And this? This is hush money. Plain and simple." Delaney didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it either. He just let the silence stretch between them, his expression unreadable. Elijah reached forward, took the envelope in his hand, felt the weight of it, the cheap way they were trying to buy him off, and then, without hesitation, he ripped it in half. Delaney's expression didn't change, but the tension in the room sharpened. "I don't need your money," Elijah said, voice steady. "What I need is justice." Delaney inhaled slowly, and for the first time, Elijah saw something cold settle behind his eyes. The moment of negotiation was over, the pretense of goodwill slipping just slightly, giving way to something harder, something sharper. "You should think carefully about what you're doing," Delaney said, his voice dipping into something lower, something edged. Elijah smiled. Not out of amusement, out of certainty. "You should think carefully about what you've done." The sheriff held his gaze for a long moment, neither of them moving, neither of them blinking. Two men sitting across from each other, knowing that this was only the beginning. And Elijah wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The moment Elijah stepped out of the station, the heat hit him like a wall, the thick, humid air settling over his bruised skin like a suffocating blanket. The sun had shifted lower in the sky, the afternoon dragging into something heavier, the kind of slow-moving time that made everything feel more significant, more deliberate. He didn't rush, didn't stagger, didn't wince. He walked the same way he had walked in, controlled, steady, in command of himself. Every muscle in his body ached. His ribs pulsed with every breath. The dull throb in his wrist, a reminder of how hard they had tightened those cuffs, how much they had wanted to break him down. But he was still standing, and that was more than Tate, Riggins, and Delaney had ever expected. The town square stretched out ahead, quiet but not empty. People lingered, watching. A few older men sat outside the barber shop, their conversation hushed, their eyes flicking up at him before shifting away, pretending they hadn't noticed, pretending none of it had happened. Across the street, a woman leaving the grocery store slowed just slightly, her gaze lingering for half a second too long before she hurried to her car, shoulders tensing like she didn't want to be involved, because that was how it always was. They had seen, they had heard, but they wouldn't say a damn thing. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, the anger still there, buried beneath the surface, but now it had weight, direction, purpose. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Inside the station, the tension had not lifted. Delaney had returned to his desk, the torn envelope still lying in two neat halves atop the polished wood, an unspoken declaration of war. He hadn't moved it, hadn't touched it, hadn't so much as looked at it since Elijah walked out. Tate and Riggins stood near the corner of the room, speaking in hushed tones, their backs stiff, their movements tense. Two men who had felt power slip through their fingers and didn't know how to get it back. Delaney exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples, the weight of the mistake pressing down on him. He should have known, should have seen it the second he walked into the station and felt the shift in the air. Tate, for all his arrogance, for all his brute confidence had gotten ahead of himself. And now, there was no taking it back. "He's not gonna let this go," Riggins muttered, his voice low, uneasy. Delaney already knew that. The man had ripped the money in half, stared him in the eye, and told him in no uncertain terms that this was only the beginning. Of course he wasn't going to let it go. The question wasn't whether Elijah Cole was going to make a move. It was what he was going to do first. Elijah sat in the dim light of his apartment. The only sound the slow, steady hum of the ceiling fan overhead, the rhythmic creak of the old blades cutting through the silence. His ribs still ached, his body stiff from the weight of what had happened, but he didn't move, didn't shift, didn't let the discomfort pull him out of the focus that had settled into his bones. His laptop sat open on the small kitchen table, the glow of the screen casting sharp blue light across his face. Lines of information scrolled in front of him, records, reports, old case files buried in places the public wasn't meant to find. But Elijah wasn't the public. He was a hunter. He had spent his career tracking down war criminals in places where law didn't exist, where men operated outside of consequence, outside of accountability. He had torn them apart, piece by piece, not through force, not through direct confrontation, through patience, through exposure. And that was exactly what he was about to do here. The Ridgepoint Police Department had skeletons. Of course they did. Every department like this did. What Elijah needed to find wasn't just corruption. It was a pattern. Something big enough, undeniable enough, that even Ridgepoint couldn't ignore it. He started with Tate and Riggins. Their records were exactly what he had expected. Years of complaints, use of force incidents, reports that had mysteriously gone missing, evidence that had conveniently been lost. Tate had been accused of excessive force 3 times in the past 5 years, all cases dismissed. Riggins had 2. Then there were the names. Names of people who had come before him, people who had been stopped, arrested, beaten down, chewed up and spit out by a system that had never been designed to protect them in the first place. Names that had been forgotten. Except now? Now, they wouldn't be. He scrolled further, digging deeper, pulling threads, following trails, his mind working through the puzzle as his body remained still, his focus sharp, unyielding. And then he found it, the case that had never been solved. A young man, arrested 5 years ago, taken in for questioning, and never seen again. The official report claimed he had been released that same night. But the details were vague, inconsistent, riddled with errors that weren't errors at all. They were intentional omissions. His stomach twisted, something cold curling beneath his skin, because he had seen this before. He had seen it overseas. He had seen it in places where men disappeared in the dead of night and were never spoken of again, and he wasn't going to let it happen here. Elijah exhaled slowly, sitting back, letting his eyes drift over the name again. Marcus Reed. That was the key. That was the crack in the foundation. Now all he had to do was break it wide open. His screen was a patchwork of open files, reports pulled from places the department never expected anyone to look, evidence that had been buried under so many layers of falsified paperwork that the truth barely existed anymore. But truth had a way of resurfacing, and he was pulling it up with both hands. Tate had been dirty for years. Elijah traced the records back nearly a decade, finding the same patterns over and over again. Stops that never made it into the system, complaints that disappeared before they could be investigated, use of force reports that had been marked as resolved without any explanation. He wasn't just a violent cop, he was protected. The kind of man the department closed ranks around whenever his name came up in the wrong places. The kind of officer whose record should have been a career-ending disaster, but had somehow remained pristine on the surface. And Riggins? Riggins was a coward. He didn't have Tate's history, didn't have the same long list of brutality complaints, but he was complicit. He was the kind of cop who stood by and let it happen. The kind who didn't get his hands dirty, but never stopped the ones who did. His reports were always vague, always incomplete, always missing just enough detail to protect himself from scrutiny. He had been there for every one of Tate's incidents, but somehow he had never been the one under investigation until now. Elijah leaned back, stretching slightly, his ribs aching as he exhaled, the weight of what he had uncovered sitting heavy in his chest. He wasn't just looking at a couple of bad cops. He was looking at a pattern of corruption that had been allowed to thrive, unchecked, for years. This wasn't just about what they had done to him. This was about all the people who had come before him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. The line clicked after 2 rings. Elijah? Jada Williams, investigative journalist. One of the few people in this town who actually gave a damn. You still looking for a story? There was a pause. Then, her voice sharpened. What do you have? He glanced at the screen, at the files stacked in front of him. More than you'll know what to do with. The surveillance started that night. Elijah sat in his car, parked a block down from Tate's house, watching the glow of the porch light flicker against the worn siding, the shadows stretching long across the driveway. The street was quiet, the houses spaced apart just enough that no one paid much attention to who came and went. Just enough privacy for a man like Tate to feel untouchable. He had spent years tracking targets through foreign cities, memorizing their movements, learning their habits, understanding the patterns they didn't even realize they had. This was no different. Tate had routines. He left the house at 6:45 a.m. sharp, coffee in one hand, his badge clipped onto his belt before he even reached the car. He didn't linger, didn't waste time. He was a man who moved with the certainty of someone who had never had to be afraid. He took the same route to the station every morning, stopped at the same gas station for coffee when he wasn't running late, drove 5 miles over the speed limit down the same back road because he knew no one was ever going to pull him over. He wasn't a man who believed in consequences, and that was about to change. Elijah shifted his gaze to the house across the street. Riggins' place. Smaller, less maintained. A front yard with weeds pushing up through the cracks in the sidewalk. Unlike Tate, Riggins didn't carry himself with the same confidence. He hesitated. His porch light stayed on longer than it needed to. His curtains shifted slightly at odd hours, like he was always checking, always making sure. He was nervous, and he had every reason to be. Elijah tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, watching the way Riggins' silhouette moved through the house, stopping in front of a window before retreating again. He wasn't stupid. He knew something was coming. And the best part? He didn't even know how bad it was going to be yet. Elijah let out a slow breath, his pulse steady, his mind already mapping out the next steps. Tomorrow, the first leak would drop. Tate and Riggins were going to wake up to their names in the news, to files that should have never seen the light of day being aired out for the whole town to see. The weight of their history, of every injustice they had buried, was about to be dragged into the open, and there wouldn't be a damn thing they could do to stop it. This was just the beginning, and by the time Elijah was done, they would never feel untouchable again. The morning air hung thick over Ridgepoint, the early sunlight stretching across the storefronts and empty sidewalks, the town waking slowly, unaware that everything had already changed. Inside the police station, however, the change was unmistakable. Tate stepped through the front doors, coffee in hand, his usual confidence intact, until he felt the shift in the air. Conversations had stalled. Officers who had been speaking in low murmurs quieted as he walked past, their gazes flicking toward him, then away, avoiding direct eye contact. Some of them had their phones out, scrolling, their faces tight with something he couldn't place. Concern, unease, maybe even fear. Riggins was already at his desk, hunched over, his face pale, his grip on his phone tight. He didn't even look up when Tate approached, too busy staring at something on the screen. his shoulders drawn in as though he were bracing himself. Tate slowed his steps, his smirk fading, an unfamiliar unease settling in his stomach. "What's going on?" Riggins didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his phone around, shoved it toward Tate. And Tate saw it. His name, in bold, on the front page of the Ridgepoint Gazette. A deep-dive exposé, a detailed list of every brutality complaint, every excessive force report, every case that had conveniently gone away. And attached to it, the evidence. Official department files, leaked and displayed for the whole town to see. Tate's grip tightened around the phone, his pulse hammering in his ears as he scanned the article. His stomach twisting with something sharp and unfamiliar. Everything was there. Every stop that had led to violence. Every complaint that had been filed and ignored. Every name of every person who had tried to get justice but had been quietly dismissed. Their voices buried under the weight of police reports, stamped with the words, "Resolved, no further action." And it wasn't just him. Riggins's name was there too, not as the aggressor, but as the man who had looked the other way. His signature was on multiple reports, the same reports that had been leaked, that were now out in the open for everyone to see. Tate's jaw clenched as the realization sank in. Someone had done this. Someone had come after them. His thoughts moved fast, his mind racing through possibilities, but he already knew. There was only one person who had a reason to pull these files. Elijah Cole. The man had sat there in cuffs, beaten, bleeding, and still looking at them like he had already won. And now he was tearing them apart. Across town, Elijah sat in the corner of a small diner, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, the newspaper folded neatly beside him on the countertop. He wasn't reading it anymore. He didn't need to. He had put it there. Jada had handled the publishing, but he had done the digging. He had unearthed what the department had tried so hard to hide. And now they couldn't bury it. He could hear people talking about it, low murmurs drifting through the air. "Did you see the paper?" Someone muttered a few seats down. "Yeah. Always knew Tate was bad news, but this?" A whistle. "They're going to be in trouble now." Elijah lifted his coffee, taking a slow sip, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Let them talk. The more the town paid attention, the harder it would be for the department to cover it up. This was only the beginning. Back at the station, Delaney's office was silent. He sat behind his desk, the newspaper open in front of him, his fingers tapping against the wood in slow, deliberate beats. His face was unreadable, but Tate could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers pressed harder against the surface of the desk with each passing second. When he finally lowered the paper, he exhaled slowly, lifting his gaze to Tate and Riggins, both of whom stood stiffly in front of him. Elijah Cole did this. Tate didn't need to be told twice. "Yeah." Delaney didn't look at him. Instead, he turned to Riggins. "Do you understand what this means?" Riggins hesitated. It means, Delaney cut in, his voice sharp, "that if this doesn't stop, we're all going down. You think this stays with the two of you? You think the department doesn't get dragged through the mud with you? You think I don't get dragged down?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze cold, calculating. "This is bigger than you now, and it needs to be dealt with before it gets worse." Tate swallowed. "What do you want us to do?" Delaney was quiet for a moment, his fingers still tapping against the desk, a measured, thoughtful silence. Then he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "We tried doing things the easy way," he said, voice dipping lower. "Tried shutting him up the way we always have. That didn't work." His gaze sharpened. "So now we send a message." Tate's breath steadied, his pulse evening out as the weight of the words settled between them. Riggins, on the other hand, stiffened slightly. "What are you saying?" Delaney's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm saying you put on some masks, and you remind him exactly what happens when people start sticking their noses where they don't belong." Silence. Then Riggins shook his head, his hands flexing at his sides. "We can't—" "You can," Delaney interrupted, his voice firm. "And you will." His gaze flicked between them, settling on Tate. This isn't just about Cole anymore. This is about control. If we let him make fools of us, if we let him expose us without consequence, do you know what happens next? Neither of them answered. Delaney leaned back slightly, his expression cold. More people come forward. More people start digging. More people think they can take us down. His fingers tapped once more against the desk. Once, twice, final. This stops now, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Make sure he gets the message. Tate nodded. Riggins hesitated, but in the end, he nodded too, because they both knew there was no walking away from this. The night stretched long and heavy, the kind of thick, oppressive heat that clung to the streets and made everything feel slower, heavier, as if the whole town was holding its breath. But Elijah was calm, focused, controlled. He had known for hours now. The moment the article had dropped, the moment the first name had been exposed, the moment he had seen the way Tate and Riggins carried themselves after it, he had known. The way Tate had clenched his jaw too tight in the station, the way Riggins's fingers had twitched near his belt, like a man barely holding on to his composure, the way Delaney had stared at them both with something cold behind his eyes, this had been inevitable. They had been backed into a corner, and cornered men always lashed out. It was just a matter of when. So he had prepared. Not in panic, not in fear, in precision. The cameras had been placed 2 days ago, angles carefully chosen, blind spots eliminated. It wasn't just about catching the fight, it was about framing the truth. The location had been picked even earlier than that, because he knew how men like Tate operated, how they liked to drag their prey into the dark. But tonight, the dark would not protect them. Tonight, the shadows had eyes. The feeling started the moment he left the diner. A slow, creeping sense of something shifting behind him. Not movement, not sound, but presence. He kept his steps even, his hands loose in his pockets. But he felt them. He didn't turn around, didn't speed up, didn't stop. He just listened. The soft hum of an engine, just distant enough to keep pace without drawing attention. A car rolling past an intersection, slowing at the curb, never stopping, never parking, just hovering. They were following, but not attacking. Not yet, because they wanted control. Because they thought he was still unsuspecting, and Elijah let them believe it. He walked past the dim glow of street lights, his shadow stretching long over the cracked pavement, his path deliberate, each turn leading him exactly where he needed to be. The alley behind Sutter's Hardware, a narrow space wedged between two buildings, running parallel to an apartment row. Windows lining the second and third floors. Occupied, open, perfect. The key wasn't just the space. It was who could see it, and who could hear. He stepped in, slow, measured, shoulders loose, breathing even. He heard the car slow. The doors opened, 4 sets of footsteps. Heavy, intentional. And then, silence. The moment before the strike. Elijah let it stretch, let them feel in control, let them believe they had the upper hand. Then he turned, slowly, deliberately, facing them. Tate stood in front, mask pulled down, because he wanted Elijah to know. Riggins beside him, his hands curled into fists, but not confident, not steady. 2 others flanked them, unknown men, faces covered, extra muscle, meant to stack the numbers, meant to make sure nothing went wrong. But it already had. Because they had walked into his trap, Tate took a slow step forward, his breath sharp, his body coiled with barely restrained fury. You should have let it go. Elijah didn't blink. He just waited. The night was thick with tension, the kind that settled into the bones, the kind that carried weight long before the first punch was thrown. Elijah had led them here, step by step, knowing exactly how it would unfold. And now, as he stood in the narrow alley behind Sutter's Hardware, windows lining the upper floors, shadows moving inside, streetlights casting long streaks of light across the cracked pavement, He knew he had them. He could hear their footsteps before he saw them. Slow, deliberate. Tate, Riggins. Two more masked men. The air shifted as they stepped in behind him, closing off the exit, surrounding him just enough that they thought they were controlling the moment. They weren't. Tate exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You should have stopped when you had the chance. Elijah didn't move, didn't flinch. Just let them fill the space. Let them take the bait. Tate took another step forward. You think this is a game? You think you can walk around town, running your mouth, trying to ruin everything we built? His voice dropped lower, cold, measured. You should have just taken the money. Elijah let out a slow breath. He had been waiting for that. For them to say it. For them to admit it. He tilted his head slightly, his voice calm, steady. You mean the money to keep quiet? To let you go back to doing whatever you want? He scoffed. No. Tate's face darkened, his hands flexing at his sides. Elijah watched, waited. Then Tate gave himself away. You're gonna take down those files. His voice tightened. You're gonna stop talking. You're gonna disappear. There it was. The confession. Elijah just needed the next part. Tate stepped closer, his body coiled with rage. Or we make sure you do. And then he swung. Elijah had seen it coming the second Tate shifted his weight. But he didn't dodge. He let it land. The fist connected, a hard, wild shot to his jaw, the force snapping his head to the side, pain exploding across his face. But he stayed on his feet. Another hit, this time from Riggins. Sloppy, hesitant, but it still landed. Elijah staggered back. Not because he couldn't take it, but because he needed them to believe they had the upper hand. Because right now, people were watching. And cameras? Cameras don't lie. Tate pressed forward, emboldened now, his voice sharp. Not so tough now, huh? Elijah breathed in slowly, ignoring the pain in his ribs. This is the part where you think you've won. Tate sneered. I already have. Elijah's lips curved slightly. Not yet. Then he moved. Fast. Precise. The soldier in him switching on. His elbow snapped up, catching Tate in the ribs. Hard. Tate grunted, staggering, but before he could react, Elijah twisted, catching Riggins' wrist as he tried to grab him. A sharp pull, a pivot, and Riggins crashed to the ground, wind knocked out of him. The two masked men hesitated, then lunged. Elijah pivoted. The first swing came wild, desperate. He ducked low, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest, sending him back. The second man tried to grab him from behind, but Elijah spun, catching him with a brutal knee to the stomach, followed by a sharp hook to the jaw. One down. Tate recovered, coming back fast. This time, Elijah didn't let him get close. A sharp kick, straight to the knee. Tate buckled, cursing as he dropped halfway down. Elijah grabbed him by the back of the head, slamming him forward, letting his face meet the cold brick wall. Tate groaned, his breath ragged. Elijah leaned in, his voice low, sharp. You still think you own this town? Tate's hands curled into fists, but he was shaking now. You think you decide who gets to speak, who gets to fight back? Elijah's voice was steady, controlled, not breathless, not frantic. He was in charge now. You've spent years doing this to people. How's it feel when the whole world gets to see it happen to you? Tate's breathing was sharp, but he wasn't answering. Riggins was still gasping for air, his hands shaking as he tried to push himself up. We can fix this, he stammered. We can still... Elijah turned to him. Fix this? He let out a slow breath, stepping closer, letting the words settle. That's what you've always done, isn't it? You fix things, you bury things, you erase people, their stories, their pain, and you walk away clean. His head tilted slightly. But not this time. Because this time, people were watching. Windows were open above them. A voice from the street called out, Somebody get the cops! More movement. A faint red glow. A recording light. Elijah took one last breath, stepping back, letting it sink in. Because Tate had just dug his own grave. The fight was over. But the weight of it still hung thick in the air. the energy of violence lingering like the heat of a fire that had just burned out. The alley, once silent, was now alive with the murmurs of voices, the shifting of bodies, the unmistakable tension of people stepping out from the shadows, drawn in by the commotion, by the sounds of bodies hitting pavement, by the unmistakable crack of flesh meeting bone. It had started as whispers, hushed words passing between neighbors watching from windows above, from people who had cracked open their doors and peered into the alleyway, unsure at first, uncertain of what exactly they were seeing. But now, the scene was impossible to ignore. Tate lay against the brick wall, one palm pressed flat against the rough surface, his breath heavy, his ribs heaving, his face tight with barely controlled pain, and something deeper, something raw, something he had never felt before. It wasn't just the physical pain, wasn't just the ache of bruises forming beneath his skin, or the sting of a split lip, or the weight of exhaustion settling into his limbs. It was the realization, the crushing understanding that for the first time, he had lost control. He had spent years walking these streets with unchecked confidence, with the knowledge that no matter what he did, no matter how hard he hit, no matter how many people he left broken in the street, he would always be protected. He had built his power on fear, on silence, on the certainty that people would always look away. But now, they weren't looking away. Riggins was on his knees a few feet away, one hand pressed to his ribs, his other palm bracing against the ground as he struggled to process what had just happened. His breaths short, ragged, uneven, his eyes unfocused. He had never been as bold as Tate, had never been the one to swing first, had never been the kind of man to carry power well, but he had followed, had stood beside Tate, had signed the reports, had played his part, and now, as he knelt there, the reality of his choices settled over him like a weight he could no longer carry. And Elijah? Elijah stood. He wasn't shaking, wasn't faltering, wasn't gasping for air or reaching for support. His lip was split, his jaw ached, his ribs burned from the initial blows, but he stood calm, measured, unwavering. The fight had been brutal, had been fast, had been deliberate, but now, in the aftermath, he was the only one still on his feet. The cameras, carefully placed, had captured everything. The voices above, the witnesses at the alley's entrance, had seen it unfold, had watched as Tate and Riggins swung first, had heard their words, had heard the threats, had seen the violence. The story was already being written, not by Tate this time, not by the department, not by the men who had spent their careers twisting truth into something unrecognizable, but by the people who had watched it happen, by the footage that would be impossible to erase, by the reality that, for once, could not be buried. And then, the sirens came, sharp, cutting through the tension, the unmistakable wail of authority moving in fast, tires screeching against pavement as squad cars pulled up just beyond the alley entrance, their flashing lights washing everything in streaks of red and blue, illuminating the wreckage of what had just taken place. The officers moved quickly, but there was hesitation in their movements, an uncertainty that hadn't been there before, a break in the usual rhythm, as though even they could feel the shift in the air, as though even they knew, before a single word had been spoken, that this was different. The first officer through the alleyway had his hand near his holster, his body tense as his eyes swept the scene. But then he saw Tate, and he stopped. For a moment, he just stared, as though his mind was struggling to process what he was seeing, as though he had never, in his years of walking these streets, expected to see Tate like this. Another officer came in behind him, younger, less experienced, one of the new hires Tate had probably barked orders at just a week ago, and he, too, hesitated, his steps faltering as his gaze flickered between the figures in front of him, the battered forms of two officers and the man who was still standing, who, despite the blood at the corner of his mouth, and the bruises forming beneath his skin did not look defeated. And then came the crowd. The people who had once only been voices behind cracked windows now stepped fully into the open, their numbers growing, their presence undeniable. A woman stood near the entrance of the alley, her robe pulled tight around her, her arms crossed over her chest, watching. A young man at the corner held his phone high, the glow of the screen flickering against his face, recording. More were emerging, murmuring amongst themselves, exchanging looks, the weight of what they had just seen settling in. "What the hell happened here?" the lead officer finally asked, his voice steady. But there was no aggression in it, no immediate assumption, no automatic defense of the men on the ground. Tate pushed himself off the wall slightly, dragging in a breath, his hand tightening into a fist at his side as he straightened, as though he was about to reclaim control, as though he could still spin this into something he could use. "He attacked us," Tate said, his voice rough, but there was something else underneath it now, something cracked, something not quite whole. "He resisted." "No, he didn't," a voice cut in sharply. The young man at the corner stepped forward, his phone still raised, his grip firm. "I got the whole thing on video." The alley went still. Tate didn't move. Riggins's breath hitched. Elijah exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, letting it settle, letting them all feel it. The lead officer let out a slow breath, his lips pressing together briefly before he turned, his gaze shifting from Tate to Riggins to Elijah. "You all right?" Elijah lifted a hand, wiping the blood from his lip, his voice even. "I'm fine." He let the weight of the moment linger before adding, "But I'd like to press charges." The murmurs rippled through the crowd again, the reality of those words sinking in, because this had never happened before. Because it was supposed to be Tate pressing charges. It was supposed to be Riggins filing the report. It was supposed to be Elijah in cuffs. And yet, here they stood, Tate's face twisted, his jaw tightening, his breath coming harder now, his shoulders rigid with disbelief, because this wasn't how the world had ever worked for him. "You're not serious," Tate muttered, his voice lower now, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven breaths. Elijah met his gaze, his expression unshaken, dead serious. Tate let out a sharp breath, shaking his head, his fingers curling slightly. "You can't." "I can." Elijah exhaled, slow, deliberate, "and I will." The lead officer hesitated for only a second, before finally exhaling, his shoulders settling as though he had just come to terms with something, as though he had just accepted the inevitable. "We're going to need to take you both in for questioning." The crowd reacted immediately. Gasps, movement, murmurs growing louder, people exchanging looks. Because this wasn't just about one fight. This was about change. This was about accountability. This was about justice finally shifting. And Elijah? Elijah had just ensured that for the first time in their lives, Tate and Riggins were the ones who had to answer for what they had done. Elijah stood outside the police station, the night air still heavy, the remnants of the fight settling into his skin like a lingering ache, but he barely felt it anymore. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by something steadier, something colder, something that had been waiting inside him for a long time. He had spent years watching men like Tate walk free, watching their violence go unanswered, watching them stand behind their badges, behind their system, behind the weight of a town that had been built to protect them. But tonight, the weight had shifted. The sirens had come fast, their flashing lights casting sharp, jagged shadows against the alley walls. But by the time the officers had stepped out, by the time their hands had hovered over their holsters, by the time their voices had called out, demanding to know what had happened, the truth had already been written. Elijah hadn't needed to speak. The voices around him had done that for him. The people standing at the alley's edge, the ones peering from windows, the ones still holding their phones high, recording every second of the aftermath, had made sure that no version of this story would belong to the department. There would be no missing body camera footage, no falsified reports, no erased evidence. It was all there, out in the open, undeniable. And now, Tate and Riggins had been taken in, their wrists locked in cuffs, their faces exposed to the crowd, forced to walk the same path they had made so many others walk before. Elijah had watched it happen, his breath steady, his body aching, but his mind sharper than it had ever been. Because this was what justice looked like, and there wasn't a single thing Tate could do to stop it. Inside the station, the weight of the night had settled over everything like a suffocating fog, pressing against the walls, slowing every movement, shifting the energy of the room in a way that could not be ignored. Elijah had been here before, had walked through these halls once with his hands in cuffs, his ribs aching, his breath short from the blows Tate and Riggins had landed on him that night, their voices filled with the certainty that there would be no consequences. But now he walked in free, unchained, standing tall, while they were the ones being dragged through the doors, while they were the ones sitting stiffly in chairs, their expressions carefully controlled, but not enough to hide the cracks forming beneath the surface. Officers turned as he entered, their gazes flickering toward him, unreadable, uncertain, the usual rhythm of the station thrown off course. Some were pretending not to see him, keeping their heads down, their focus locked on their desks, their conversations hushed, their fingers scrolling through their phones, because they had seen the video. Others lingered near the edges of the room, watching without speaking, without moving, as though waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to see which way the department would shift. The divide was already forming. Elijah could see it. There were those who had spent years standing beside Tate, following his lead, covering for him, knowing exactly what he was, exactly what he did, but doing nothing. And then there were the others, the ones who had never spoken up, who had never dared, who had looked away, but had never truly belonged to the same world Tate had built. And now, as Tate sat in the holding room, his hands resting on the table, his face locked in that tight, unreadable mask, they were all being forced to make a choice. Elijah stepped deeper into the station, his footsteps slow, measured, controlled. He wasn't rushing this, because this was the moment everything changed. The video had already spread, moving through Ridgepoint like wildfire, each frame exposing every truth that had been buried for years, every injustice that had been written off, every lie that had been crafted to protect men like Tate. The town was watching now, waiting to see what would happen, waiting to see if the system would protect them again. Elijah wasn't going to let that happen. An officer hesitated in front of him, his stance rigid, his throat bobbing slightly as he tried to keep his expression neutral. Elijah held his gaze. "I'd like to file charges." The man swallowed, exhaling slowly before nodding once, stepping aside. And just like that, it was done. There was no argument, no resistance, because they all knew. They had seen the proof, had heard the words straight from Tate's mouth, had watched as he swung first, had seen how quickly he had lost the fight, had felt the weight of it settle over the town in a way that could not be ignored. Elijah turned his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the door of the holding room where Tate and Riggins sat, the tension inside thick enough to feel from the other side of the wall. For a moment, he just watched. Then, finally, he allowed himself the smallest, slowest exhale. The reckoning had begun, and there was nothing Tate could do to stop it. Elijah sat on the station bench, his body still carrying the weight of the night, his ribs aching from the blows that had landed. But none of it mattered now. The pain was distant, secondary, pushed to the edges of his mind as he listened to the station unravel around him. The usual hum of low conversations had turned sharp, voices cutting over one another in heated whispers, hurried footsteps moving between desks, tension shifting through the air like a current just before a storm. Officers weren't working. They were watching, waiting, processing the reality that had just been forced upon them. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, news feeds flooded with the same images, the same videos, the same headlines that were now gripping the town in a way that could no longer be ignored. First, it had been the fight. The footage had spread fast, first through social media, then to news outlets, each frame painting the picture in brutal clarity. The masked figures in the alley, the voices captured in the heat of the moment, Tate and Riggins making their threats, throwing the first punches, trying to beat a man into silence the same way they had done so many times before. But this time, the city had seen it. And then, an even bigger blow, the story of Elijah's original arrest had resurfaced. Someone inside the department had leaked it. The mugshot, the bruises, the falsified police report detailing his supposed resisting arrest. The hospital records from that night. The footage from inside the station that should have been deleted but had somehow resurfaced. Everything. The town, the state, the entire country was seeing the truth now. The undeniable timeline of corruption. First, they had beaten him at the station. Then, when that hadn't worked, they had tried to finish the job in the alley. Now, it wasn't just Elijah's story anymore. It was everyone's. Inside the conference room, the department was fracturing. Sheriff Delaney stood at the head of the table, his fingers pressed tightly against the smooth wood, his jaw locked, his face pale beneath the harsh glow of the overhead light. His officers had gathered, some standing, others seated, but all watching, all waiting, some with narrowed eyes, others with arms crossed, a few refusing to look at him directly, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, because they all knew what this meant. The department wasn't just dealing with bad optics. This was a full-scale collapse. "What we need to do now is control the narrative," Delaney said, his voice sharp, his usual calm now brittle at the edges. "This is a smear job. That's what this is. The media is twisting what happened, making it into something it's not. You've all seen these headlines. They're making us out to be criminals." A heavy silence followed. Then, finally, someone broke it. "This ain't a smear job," Officer Martinez said, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze unblinking. "It's the truth." A shift in the room. Small, but noticeable. Delaney's expression flickered for the briefest second before he recovered. "Watch yourself, Martinez." "No," Martinez said, shaking his head slightly, his tone low but firm. "No, I won't. Because I've been watching myself for years, watching Tate get away with this, watching you cover for him, watching people walk in here broken and leave in worse shape than when they came in. You want us to believe this is just the media twisting things?" His head tilted slightly. "What about the video? What about the masks? What about the fact that Tate and Riggins went after a man and got their heads handed to them in front of half the town?" More movement now. Other officers nodding, a few shifting in their chairs, uncomfortable but not disagreeing. Delaney exhaled sharply, pushing back from the table slightly, his hands settling on his hips. "Tate's been with us for a long time," he said carefully, his voice measured, trying to regain control, trying to remind them of where their loyalty was supposed to be. "He's done a lot for this town," Martinez scoffed. "Yeah, and now we're all gonna pay for it." Another voice spoke up, this time from near the door. "He's right," Officer Davis muttered, shaking his head. "This ain't just about Tate anymore. This is about you, Sheriff. We followed your orders. We backed you. We defended this department. And now," he gestured vaguely toward the screens, where headlines were flashing in real time, news anchors speaking in urgent voices, repeating the same key phrases over and over. "Small-town corruption scandal. Police brutality caught on tape. Department-wide cover-up. You think we're gonna go down with you?" Davis continued. "You think we're gonna take the hit so you can walk away clean?" Delaney's expression tightened. "No one is taking a hit." "That's the problem," Martinez said, his voice colder now, sharper. "It ain't up to you anymore." The words landed hard, settling over the room, forcing the truth into the open. Because for the first time, Delaney wasn't in control, and the officers knew it. Outside the conference room, Elijah stood near the station entrance, arms folded loosely over his chest, listening. He didn't have to be inside the room to know what was happening. He had spent years studying power, learning how it moved, how it fractured, how it collapsed when pushed in just the right way. He had seen it overseas, had watched men who had ruled through fear crumble the second their own people turned on them. And now, standing in the station, feeling the tension rolling through the walls, he was watching it happen here. Tate had fallen. Riggins had followed. And now Delaney was next. Because the thing about corrupt men was that they were only as strong as the people willing to protect them. And now, no one was willing to protect Delaney. Elijah exhaled slowly, shifting his weight slightly, his ribs still aching, his body still carrying the remnants of the fight. But his mind was already moving forward. He wasn't done yet. There were still pieces left to fall, still details to expose, still pressure to apply. But this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment the department turned on itself. The weight pressing down on the Ridgepoint Police Department had turned into something suffocating, something inescapable, something that couldn't be ignored no matter how hard Delaney tried to pretend otherwise. The station wasn't functioning anymore, not in the way it once had, not in the way he had spent years ensuring it would. The usual rhythm was gone, replaced by a current of unease, of whispered conversations behind closed doors, of officers exchanging glances that carried meanings he could no longer control. The station had always moved as a singular force, working under unspoken agreements, rules that had never been written down but had always been understood. But now, those rules had been broken. It had started with Tate and Riggins sitting in holding, their presence in the station itself a symbol of everything unraveling. A reminder that the power Delaney had built wasn't as untouchable as he had once believed. But it was the leak of Elijah's original arrest, the undeniable connection between what had happened that night and what had happened in the alley, that had pushed things past the point of no return. The narrative had slipped away from the department's grasp, and with it, so had their protection. The district attorney had moved fast, faster than Delaney had anticipated, as if they had been waiting for a moment like this, waiting for a scandal big enough to justify turning against the very system that had shielded them for years. The arrest video, the footage from the alley, the reports of excessive force, the patterns of complaints, ignored, erased, rewritten. It had all come crashing down at once, a flood of evidence sweeping through the station like a fire that couldn't be put out. And now, prosecution was coming. Oh, Elijah sat in the back of the room, arms crossed over his chest, posture relaxed, despite the tension stretching through the department. He had spent years hunting men who thought they were untouchable, tracking them, finding the cracks in their armor, pressing down until their own people turned on them, until the very foundations they had built their power on crumbled beneath them. And now, he was watching it happen again. Only this time, he hadn't needed to leave the country. This time, the enemy had been right here at home. He watched as Delaney stood at the center of the room, his shoulders squared, his expression blank. But Elijah could see it, the tightness in his jaw, the way his hands stayed locked at his sides, the way his eyes flickered between the officers standing in front of him. He was losing them, and he knew it. The DA's office had sent investigators in, suits walking through the station, speaking quietly with officers, gathering statements, putting together a case that had already been built for them, piece by the evidence Elijah had put into motion. There had been whispers that morning, talks of indictments, of official charges being filed, of legal consequences that could no longer be ignored. But it wasn't until Tate and Riggins spoke that everything truly broke apart. Chattered, the confession came in fragments, in hushed voices, in the desperate, panicked words of men who had run out of places to hide. Riggins broke first. Elijah had expected as much. He had seen the weakness in him from the beginning, the hesitation, the reluctance, the way he had followed Tate, but had never truly belonged to the same kind of ruthless certainty that Tate had carried so easily. He had seen it in the alley, The way Riggins had frozen just before throwing the first punch. The way his body had hesitated in the moment before violence, as though some part of him had known even then that they were walking into a trap, and now he was the first to turn. "We didn't decide to go after him," Riggins muttered, his voice hoarse, his hands pressed flat against the table, his fingers twitching as if he was barely holding himself together. "It wasn't us. We didn't come up with it." Across from him, the DA's investigator leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. But Elijah could see what was happening. They had already known the answer, but they needed to hear it from Riggins himself. "Who gave the order?" the investigator asked, his voice even, patient, as if he already knew what the answer would be. Riggins swallowed hard, his throat bobbing, his breath shaky. Then, finally, the words that changed everything. "Sheriff Delaney." The room shifted. Elijah could feel it, even from where he sat. Delaney had spent his entire career ensuring that if something ever went wrong, he would never be the one to take the fall. But now he had just lost the protection of the men he had sent to do his dirty work. And Tate, for all his bravado, for all the arrogance he had carried, wasn't far behind. "You think I was going to take that heat alone?" Tate scoffed, his voice sharp, his usual confidence cracked at the edges. "You think I was the one calling the shots? We were just following orders. This whole thing? This whole mess? You think it started with me?" He let out a breath, shaking his head, his jaw clenching. "I didn't come up with the plan to go after Cole. I wasn't the one who said we had to shut him down before he could do more damage. That wasn't me. That was Delaney." And just like that, Delaney's empire collapsed. The station was in turmoil by the time the press got a hold of it. The footage had already done its damage, but now the confession had sealed it. The press conference was scheduled within hours. The DA's office had moved swiftly, publicly announcing that charges were being filed against Delaney, Tate, and Riggins, the words ringing over the station's intercom as the news broke across every channel, every online outlet, every screen flashing with the same headline: "Sheriff Delaney indicted in police brutality scandal." Elijah watched from the front steps of the station as the town absorbed the truth. People had gathered, some watching from the sidewalks, some speaking in hushed tones, some staring at the station itself as though they were seeing it clearly for the first time. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally releasing. This had never been about revenge. Not truly. This had been about justice, about forcing the town to confront what had been happening beneath the surface for years, about making sure that the people who had wielded power like a weapon could no longer hide behind it, about ensuring that when the dust settled, no one would ever forget what had happened here. And now it was time to finish this. The court dates were set, and Elijah would make sure that when Tate, Riggins, and Delaney walked into that courtroom, they would never walk out the same. The courthouse was filled to capacity, the weight of the moment stretching into every corner of the room, pressing into every seat, every breath, every glance exchanged between the people who had gathered. Not just the officers, not just the attorneys, but the townspeople, the ones who had seen this unfold in real time, the ones who had spent years watching injustices they had never been able to name, never been able to fight. Elijah sat near the front, his posture steady, his breathing controlled, his mind sharp, because this was the moment everything had been leading toward. He had chased justice across continents, had brought war criminals to their knees, had witnessed systems collapse under the weight of truth, but this was different. This was home. Sheriff Delaney sat stiff-backed at the defense table, his face pale but his jaw tight, as though still trying to hold on to the last remnants of the power he had spent decades cultivating. Tate, next to him, looked worse, his bruises from the alley fight still visible, his hands clenched in his lap, his entire body wound tight like a spring about to snap. Riggins looked the worst of all, his eyes hollow, his shoulders hunched, his face the kind of vacant that only came when a man had finally realized there was no way out. The judge, a seasoned man with a reputation for efficiency, wasted no time. "This case is not one of speculation or hearsay," he said, flipping through the files before him, his voice steady but firm. "The evidence is overwhelming. Video footage, physical injuries, recorded confessions, and a deeply troubling history of misconduct. What we are here to determine is not whether these crimes occurred, but how severe the penalties will be." A heavy silence followed. Then Elijah stood. The murmurs began immediately, voices shifting, bodies straightening, people exchanging glances as he stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady. Even Delaney turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing, watching him. The judge glanced up, raising a brow slightly. "Mr. Cole," he said, voice neutral. "You wish to make a statement?" "I do." A pause. Then a nod. "Proceed." Elijah exhaled slowly, letting his hands settle in front of him, his voice calm, deliberate, unshaken. "I know the evidence speaks for itself," he said, his gaze sweeping over the jurors, the audience, the faces of the officers watching from the back of the room. "I know you've seen the videos. I know you've heard the recordings. I know you've read the reports. But I want to tell you what happened. Not from a screen, not from a headline, but from the man who lived it." He let the words settle, let the weight of the moment sink in before he continued. "This didn't start in that alley," he said, his voice controlled, steady, but carrying the kind of force that demanded to be heard. "It started in broad daylight, in a gas station I've been going to since I was a kid. I walked inside, paid for my things, handed the cashier a $20 bill. I didn't think twice about it." He exhaled slowly. "Because why would I?" He turned slightly, facing the defense table now, his gaze locked onto Delaney, onto Tate, onto Riggins. And when they showed up, they didn't listen either. Tate's body went rigid. "You didn't ask me a single question," Elijah continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You didn't check the bill. You didn't ask for my ID. You didn't even try to figure out what had actually happened. Because you had already decided." His gaze flickered between Tate and Riggins. "You tackled me to the ground in front of strangers. You put your knees on my back. You told me to stop resisting when I wasn't moving. You hit me when I tried to speak. You arrested me for a crime I never committed." His breath was steady, even, unshaken. The courtroom was silent. Tate's fists clenched. Delaney's jaw locked. "I could have left it alone," Elijah continued. "I could have walked away. I could have let you pretend it never happened. That's what you wanted, right?" His gaze flickered to Delaney now, sharp, unwavering. "But I didn't." He exhaled slowly. "So you came for me again." A murmur of agreement from the audience, heads nodding, people leaning in closer. "You didn't come with a warrant," Elijah said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You didn't come with a badge. You came in masks, in the middle of the night, in an alley where you thought no one would see, and you tried to beat me into silence again." His voice sharpened, but this time, everyone saw. His gaze swept over the courtroom, letting the weight of that truth settle over them. "And now, you get to answer for it." The judge exhaled slowly, nodding slightly, before turning his gaze toward the defense. "Do any of the defendants wish to make a statement before sentencing?" A long silence. Then Tate spoke. "We were just following orders," he muttered, his voice lower now, no longer defiant, no longer smug. He hesitated, then finally turned toward Delaney. He gave the order. Elijah didn't move, because he had already known. The courtroom shifted. Delaney's face was pale now, his fingers pressing too hard into the table, his lips parted slightly as if struggling for words. For the first time, he looked away. The judge nodded once, flipping through his paperwork. "I will issue my sentencing first thing tomorrow morning." And just like that, it was over. Elijah stood, his breath slow, controlled, knowing that the final step was coming. Justice had already been decided. Now, it was time for sentencing. The courthouse was silent as the judge took his seat, the weight of the moment pressing down on the room, stretching into every corner, settling into every breath, every gaze fixed forward. Waiting, watching. The air was heavy with the knowledge that, after today, there would be no more delays, no more waiting, no more pretending that things would return to the way they were before. Elijah sat still, his shoulders squared, his hands resting in his lap, his face unreadable, but inside he could feel the shift. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Not just for him, not just for his case, but for the town itself. Tate, Riggins, and Delaney sat at the defense table, their expressions carefully composed. But Elijah could see it. The tightness in their jaws, the stiffness in their shoulders, the way their hands curled just slightly in their laps. They knew what was coming. The judge exhaled slowly, flipping open the file in front of him before speaking, his voice steady, firm, carrying the full weight of the authority that had once shielded men like the ones sitting before him, but not today. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the overwhelming proof presented in this case, it is clear that the actions of these men were not isolated incidents, the judge said, his voice sharp, unwavering. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a system built on abuse, a pattern of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. A murmur spread through the courtroom, people shifting, nodding, because everyone knew it was true. I am sentencing Officer Richard Riggins to 12 years in federal prison for his role in the unlawful beating and attempted intimidation of Mr. Cole, as well as his involvement in falsifying police reports and covering up prior incidents of excessive force. The judge's gaze flickered toward Riggins, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. It is clear to this court that while you were not the instigator, you were complicit. You followed orders. You chose to remain silent when you could have spoken up. And now, you will face the consequences of that choice. Riggins inhaled sharply, his jaw clenching, but he didn't speak. Elijah watched as the weight of the sentence settled into his body, into his posture, into his very breath. The judge turned his attention to the next man at the table, Officer James Tate. Tate straightened slightly, but Elijah could see the tension in his body, the way he braced himself as if he could physically hold back the inevitable. For your direct involvement in the violent assault of Mr. Cole, your use of excessive force in prior cases, your willful obstruction of justice, and your attempt to silence a man seeking to expose the truth, I am sentencing you to 25 years in federal prison. A sharp exhale rippled through the room, because that was more than anyone had expected. Tate's face went pale, his fingers curling into fists, his breath coming harder now. But still, he said nothing. Elijah watched him, his own expression unreadable, because this was the moment Tate had spent his whole life avoiding. The moment where he was no longer the one with the power. The judge turned, finally, to Delaney. The silence stretched longer now, thicker, the weight of it settling over the entire courtroom, because this was the one that mattered most. Sheriff Thomas Delaney, the man who had built Ridgepoint's police force in his image, the man who had turned a blind eye to corruption, to violence, to cruelty, not just in this case, but in dozens of others that had never seen the light of day. The man who had wielded his badge like a weapon, always protected, always untouchable, until now. The judge inhaled, his fingers pressing slightly against the desk, his voice sharp, deliberate. Sheriff Delaney, your leadership of this department was not just negligent, it was criminal. You did not just fail to prevent misconduct, you encouraged it. You did not just look away from corruption, you enabled it. And when the truth threatened to expose you, you orchestrated a violent attack against an innocent man to protect yourself. Delaney remained still, his jaw locked, his hands pressed flat against the table. But Elijah could see it, the realization, the moment he finally understood that he would not be walking away from this. This court finds you guilty of conspiracy to commit assault, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and misconduct in office. the judge continued, his voice unshaken. For these crimes, you are hereby sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The courtroom broke. Gasps, murmurs, reporters scribbling notes, people shifting, voices rising just under the threshold of control because no one had expected it to be this severe. Delaney's body went rigid, his breath slow, sharp, his face a mask of controlled fury. But it didn't matter anymore, because it was done. Because he was done. Elijah sat still, watching, absorbing, feeling the moment settle into his bones, because this was what justice looked like. For years, the town had operated under the unspoken rule that men like Delaney would always win. That no matter what happened, no matter how many times the system failed the people who needed it most, no one in power would ever have to answer for what they had done. But today, they had answered, and they weren't walking away. Outside the courthouse, the air was different. Reporters gathered in clusters, cameras flashing, voices carrying over the steps as people talked, processed, tried to make sense of what had just happened. There was no celebration, not yet. But there was something new, something that had never existed in Ridgepoint before. Hope. Elijah stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. Not as something heavy, but as something final. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the town, about what came next. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah knew that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be written by men like Delaney, because they were gone. And now, it was time to rebuild. The bell above the gas station door jingled softly as Elijah stepped inside, the cool air from the overhead vent washing over him, carrying the scent of motor oil, coffee, and faint traces of cleaning solution. The place looked the same, shelves stocked in neat rows, racks of snack foods lining the walls, the same hum of the old refrigerator at the back barely noticeable over the quiet background noise of a local radio station. But it wasn't the same. Not really. Because Elijah had walked into this store once before, had stood at this very counter, had handed over a $20 bill just like he had done 100 times before, never expecting that one transaction would change everything. His eyes flickered toward the front counter. A woman stood behind the register, mid-40s maybe, brown hair pulled into a low ponytail, tapping at the screen as she entered something into the system. She glanced up as he approached, offering a small, polite nod. "Afternoon," she greeted, her tone casual, routine. "What can I get you?" Elijah studied her for a second, absorbing the fact that it wasn't him, the cashier, the man who had called the cops on him without hesitation, who had assumed the worst before even checking the bill, who had set everything in motion with a single phone call. He was gone. "New here?" Elijah asked, keeping his voice even, measured, as if he were just making conversation. The woman glanced up again, brow slightly furrowed before she nodded. "Been here a few weeks," she said, shifting slightly as she pulled the receipt tape from the register. "Took over after the last guy got let go." "Something about bad judgment," she shrugged, clearly not invested in whatever had happened before she arrived. "Management didn't get into the details, but I guess it didn't sit right with corporate." Elijah let the words sink in. Bad judgment. That was what they were calling it. A man had made a split-second decision that nearly got Elijah killed, that led to him being beaten in the street, arrested for nothing, thrown into a cell, targeted again when he refused to stay silent, and they called it bad judgment. He let out a slow breath, absorbing the weight of it, but he wasn't angry. Not anymore, because that man was gone, because for the first time in a long time, actions had consequences. Because Ridgepoint, the town that had once been a place where men like Delaney and Tate could do whatever they wanted, where the rules had never applied to people with power, was finally changing. And that was enough. Elijah glanced at the rack of bottled water near the counter, reached for one, and placed it on the counter. The woman rang it up quickly, sliding the receipt toward him with another nod. "Anything else for you?" Elijah considered it for a second, then shook his head. "No," he said, sliding a few bills across the counter. "I've got everything I need." She gave him a polite nod, then turned back to the register. Elijah picked up the bottle, pushed open the door, and stepped back outside. The sun was bright overhead, the heat rolling off the pavement, the air thick with the scent of gas and fresh-cut grass from somewhere down the road. He took a deep breath, long, slow, steady, then exhaled, feeling something settle inside him, something that felt a lot like peace. He had come full circle, but this time he was walking away on his own terms. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day!